Hey there everybody, I'm Joshua Hodges and welcome to Channel 3. Over the past 5 weeks, there's been a lot of drama in the NASCAR Gander Outdoors Truck Series. There was the Tyler Dipple incident. He was suspended on a drug violation, only to be proven innocent by a bombshell report. There was the Las Vegas race, where Matt Crafton, Grant Enfinger, and Johnny Sauter all suffered engine failures. Crafton only stayed in the playoffs by a very small points margin that he had earned in the stage. Ironically, their teammate Ben Rhodes did not suffer an engine failure, and he was not in the playoffs. And let's not forget the incident earlier this summer between Johnny Sauter and Austin Hill. I know that's not part of the past 5 weeks, but they all have one thing in common. At some point, a playoff waiver was, is, or could have been at stake. I'm going to start very briefly with that incident between Johnny Sauter and Austin Hill. It started in Texas in June. This new aerodynamic package for the Truck Series, the one they had this year, you can side draft somebody and turn them around without even touching them. And that's exactly what Austin Hill did to Johnny Sauter. Now, that's just hard racing. Well, come to Iowa, Johnny Sauter caught up with Austin Hill and punched him out of the way in a conscious effort to spin him out. Or at least that's what it looked like to me. Well, Austin Hill wasn't about to be bullied, and so he chased down Sauter, just gave him a small tap, around goes Sauter. Either Austin Hill needs to learn how to bump and run, or Sauter just flat out didn't see it coming. Then, under caution, Sauter decides to go Kyle Busch on Ron Hornaday. He rams into Austin Hill, lifts the gas, rams Hill again, lifts his gas again, rams Hill again. Sauter gets parked by NASCAR and is suspended from the following week's race at Gateway. And to add insult to injury for Sauter, Hill ended up finishing in the top 10 anyway, thanks in part to Chastain getting DQ'd. Now, Sauter was granted a playoff waiver in light of his suspension, but he was granted a playoff waiver unconditionally. Now, personally, I think that was the wrong thing to do. I think they should have granted him a playoff waiver conditional to him winning another race. Had they done that, Sauter not having won another race after his suspension, hypothetically, that last playoff spot would have gone to Ben Rhodes, who at the time was ahead of Sauter in points. Or maybe I'm doing the math wrong. Maybe it would have gone to Harrison Burton or Todd Gilliland, or maybe even Sheldon Creed. I don't know. I'd have to look at Racing Reference again. But I'm not going to bother doing the math because that's all said and done. Okay, fine. With Sauter eliminated after the Las Vegas race and Hill having won the Las Vegas race, to me that would have been poetic justice. Until I heard about this bombshell about the engine issues. But I'll discuss more about that later on in this video. In the meantime, I'm going to move forward to August 25th, somewhere around that time, the weekend of the road race in Canada. Tyler Dipple was suspended a couple of days before the race over, quote, actions detrimental to stock car racing, close quote. Less than a week later, it's revealed that the actions in question was, in fact, getting arrested for possession of a controlled substance that was not his. He was originally stopped by a police officer for a lane change violation, and he admits to that, and he also admits to having been speeding. However, he insists that he was on a sleep deficit, and that the drugs in the backpack that the officer found, which, by the way, Dipple authorized the officer to search the vehicle, the drugs in question belonged to a friend that had accidentally left the backpack in the car. The officer, not surprisingly, and truth be told, not unfairly either, didn't believe Dipple, arrested him for possession of a controlled substance. Not surprisingly, those people that were already dragging Dipple through the mud on social media decided to drag him even deeper because supposedly this justified his suspension. To those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, I'm sorry, Todd Bodine, but I'm looking at you on this one. I know you and Dipple have since kissed and made up, but I need to send the waiver rounds to catch up with the field. Hardcore Cup fans need to catch up with the hardcore truck fans. But to everybody out there, the news of his arrest alone was proof of guilt. Until a bombshell report comes out that, among other things, the friend in question turned out to be the real deal. He actually did own the drugs in the backpack. It was his backpack, and he came forward. Instead of simply disproving Tyler Dipple's guilt, the bombshell report ended up proving Tyler Dipple's innocence. Not surprisingly, the charges were dropped, and he was reinstated to NASCAR. Here's where the issue lies. I commend NASCAR for responding the way they did, but theoretically, if Tyler Dipple had been in the playoff, he was not. He was 12th in the point standings coming out of Canada, dropped to 13th after Las Vegas because he suffered an engine failure. Again, we'll talk more about that later. But for all intensive purposes, this could easily have been one of the playoff drivers, and it could have unfairly gotten them eliminated, whoever it was. Let's pretend that it was Tyler Ankrum that had gotten suspended. I'm using Tyler Ankrum, and the reason is twofold. One, he was actually in the playoff at the time this whole ordeal went down. Two, when I initially heard the report, courtesy of my aunt, she incorrectly identified the driver in question as Tyler Ankrum. So initially I thought Tyler Ankrum had been suspended. I found out later it was Tyler Dipple. But for all intensive purposes, let's pretend it was Tyler Ankrum. Before we do this, let's take a look at how the playoff standings turned out after Bristol, after Canada, and after Vegas. With Moffitt holding his seed lead after the win at Bristol, Tyler Ankrum is dead last in the playoff, 51 points behind. After Canada, Tyler Ankrum gained 43 points. Keep this number in mind, but was 62 points behind Brett Moffitt because Brett Moffitt won again. After Las Vegas, the points having not been reset. And by the way, this chart you see is arranged incorrectly, so I apologize for that. Tyler Ankrum finished the race in one piece, and with Crafton, Sauter, and Enfinger having all suffered engine failures, Crafton only staying in because of stage points, Ankrum was able to squeeze by Sauter by a 2-point margin. Those 2 points kept Ankrum in the playoff. This is as they stand immediately following the race and post-race inspection. Now let's go back and pretend it had been Tyler Ankrum that was suspended and not Tyler Dipple. If Ankrum had been suspended, then coming out of the Canadian race, he would have been 105 points behind Moffitt. And so in the playoff finish, after Las Vegas, he would have finished with 2,059 points, and Johnny Sauter would have scraped into the last playoff spot by 7 points over teammate Grant Enfinger, who sadly, regular season championship would have been out of the playoff either way. Now, to those of you that say the playoffs suck and need to be eliminated, I will go even further. Let's take a look at the non-playoff standings after Canada. These are how the top 15 in points would look if the Truck Series were still racing for the championship on a race-per-race points chase, the way they did it all the way till 2015. So after Canada, all things being equal other than the playoff not being, well, in play, Grant Enfinger would still be the points leader. Tyler Ankrum would be 11th in points. Tyler Dipple would be stuck 12th in points by virtue of his suspension. Then coming out of Las Vegas, Enfinger would then drop 28 points back in the standings to Moffitt by virtue of his engine failure. Tyler Ankrum would still be 11th in the points, and Dipple would drop down to 13th because of his engine failure. However, coming out of Canada, had Ankrum been suspended, not Dipple, Ankrum would have been down to 13th in the points, while Dipple would have climbed up to 11th, based on an average finish of 15.3 up to that point in the season. Let's give him the 22 points for the sake of this argument. By the way, 11th, 12th, and 13th are numbered incorrectly. I apologize for this. Then, coming out of Vegas, Dipple would have dropped to 12th in points based on his engine failure. Ankrum would have been stuck in 13th. Now, with all these engine failures in mind, you might be asking yourself, how can at least 5 different trucks suffer an engine failure in one night, including 3 on the same team, all of whom are in the playoffs? And again, ironically, their 4th teammate, Ben Rhodes, was not in the playoffs. He finished in one piece. Well, to put it in layman's terms, because I'm not as mechanically inclined as most people in the racing community, if you are mechanically inclined and you know exactly what it's about, post it in the comments below. But basically, the issue was tantamount to sending the manufacturer sending teams 300 horsepower engines for a 400 horsepower truck. That led to a series of engine failures all night long, including those 3 playoff drivers from Thor Sport, Matt Crafton being the only one that was able to scrape by. I particularly don't like it for Grant Enfinger, who was the regular season champion. I don't think it's fair that he was eliminated this early in the season. Now, to be fair, he was winless up to this point in the season, but it doesn't matter. I think the way they seed the playoff drivers is not fair. I think the regular season champion should be automatically seated at the top. But that's another argument to be had for another debate. So, with all that in mind, the manufacturer has actually accepted total responsibility for this series of engine failures, and that led to Thor Sport calling for NASCAR to issue a playoff waiver to its 2 drivers, and for NASCAR to instead eliminate 4 teams come to Phoenix. Personally, I think this sounds like a great idea, but here's the problem we have with it. In the first place, the truck playoff field is just too small. Personally, I think the top 10 in the truck series should be competing in the playoffs, not just the top 8. Again, that's another discussion to be had. Quite frankly, I think the better alternative would be to hold the eliminations over until the Talladega race, which is 2 weeks away. But they're calling for a playoff waiver. Johnny Sauter got a playoff waiver earlier this season for his suspension. And most dangerously, hypothetically, if Ankrum had been suspended, not Dipple, how would NASCAR have addressed that kind of a playoff waiver? A friend of mine at the Stafford Speedway said NASCAR would just amount it to shit happens. Yeah, shit happens, but when shit happens, you need to do something about it. Here's my solution to this problem. Let's pretend that Matt Crafton missed race number 2 in the playoffs, and that Johnny Sauter missed race number 3 in the playoffs. Not 2019, I mean the playoffs in general. You allow Matt Crafton to race for double points in race number 3. Sauter, meanwhile, will automatically be granted points based on his average finish up to that point through the entire season. And you apply the double points and the auto points before the reset. I want to hear from you guys if you guys have a better solution, but no trolls please. All trolls will be black flagged. Excessive trolling may result in getting ejected from the comments section. With that being said, I'm Joshua Hodges signing off again for Channel 3.
If motorsports are not for you, click the link in the description to go to Josh's main channel.